Hello everyone, welcome back to Story Time. Now we are currently reading The Night of the Unread by Janie Martin, illustrated by Martin Tidy. Janie is a local author and she has said that we are allowed to read her stories for our Storytime sessions, although this book is a little bit scary. Now if you remember, when we have unread books, like I have many behind me now, they get a little bit angry and a little bit upset that they've not been read. And I think something bad is going to happen. So let's read part 3 and find out what happens with these unread books. The rest of the week was mainly a blur of words, of crazy adventures and wild pictures in her head. There were, however, a few notable exceptions. Mum and Dad were delighted with her new love of books. At first, then Miss Knott phoned expressing concern that Jane was reading when she was supposed to be paying attention in class. And then Mum and Dad weren't quite so delighted. "I don't know how to punish you, Jane," sighed her mum at the end of a long rant about priorities and other stuff she really wasn't listening to. "We can't ground you when you've stopped going out, and there's no point in an electronics ban when you're not using them. Perhaps we should confiscate your books," said Dad. "Yes!" Jane jumped a little too enthusiastically. Mum and Dad exchanged a look. "I suppose you could take all my unread books and put them in the loft," Jane continued, trying to sound like this would be the worst thing ever. "Don't be silly," growled Dad. "I really don't know what's going on with you, Jane. I really don't. I would hope if you had a problem at school that you'd talk to one of us. In the meantime, there'll be no sweets for a week, and I don't want to hear from Miss Knott again," said Jane's mum with another sigh. Jane had clumped her way back to her room. It wasn't fair. They were quick enough to take away anything she could play games on or ban her from watching TV. Why was it being silly to expect them to take her books away? Trapping the unread in the loft would have solved all her problems. She gave a sigh that would make her mum look like the biggest loser ever if they were on Britain's Got Sighing Talent, and picked up her book. The next day, Jane had assembled a Night of the Unread defence kit, which included a cardboard box helmet, some thick gloves, an old pair of boots and a hockey stick. She managed to jab, really, small eye holes in the box without completely destroying it, or herself. And the kit was now on the floor by her bed in readiness. Clipping the fly leaves had proved more difficult than she had expected. Firstly, she had to find paper clips. She figured that they were the kind of thing every house should have. Somewhere. She didn't want to ask her mum, who already thought she was behaving strangely. Sometimes Jane would look up from her book and catch her mum watching her with a weird expression on her face. The trouble was, she didn't just need a couple of paper clips. She needed enough to clip all her unread books and all the other books in the house. She didn't know which books her mum and Dad had read, and she didn't want to take any chances. She had found enough in the end, but all the poking around in drawers when no one was looking had wasted precious reading time. Then Jane got caught sitting on the floor in Mum and Dad's bedroom with a pile of their books next to her. She wasn't really sure why Dad was so angry. Luckily, she had just clipped the flyleaf of the last book in that pile and was about to put them back. The paper clips meant there was a huge bulge in each book that stopped them from laying completely flat, so Jane said sorry a lot and promised to put them back at once. That evening, she saw the weird expression on Dad's face, as well as Mum's. So now it was Saturday night and Jane was in bed, reading. Again. She was as ready as she could be for the Night of the Unread. If the book of fairy tales was right and it happened by the end of the week, that meant tonight. Jane reached her hand down to reassure herself that her helmet, gloves, boots and hockey stick were there, ready and waiting. Sleep had been troublesome all week. It had taken to running off somewhere until the early hours of the morning, returning to lie on Jane so heavily that she had difficulty shaking it off and getting up for school. Then, right in the middle of the afternoon lessons, it would show up, tugging on Jane's eyelids and blanketing her brain. That night, Jane was determined she was going to stay awake all night, so she would be ready if the unread started anything. Sleep, however, had other ideas and cocooned Jane in its web long before midnight. Florp! The strange noise and a cool tickling on her face woke her several hours later. Her eyes sprang open, all her senses on full alert. Florp! This time Jane saw where the noise was coming from. It was the book she had been reading, rifling its pages where it had fallen when she had dropped off. It looked like a beetle, stranded on its back. Its feeble efforts to stand up were failing miserably. Jane had read more than half the book and was relieved that this had weakened rather than antagonised it. Bang! Jane could see where a large hardback book had landed on the floor. It was having no difficulty hauling itself upright. She reached for her Knight of the Unread defence kit, dragged on the boots, then the gloves, carefully positioned the cardboard box helmet so that she could see through the eye holes, and grabbed the hockey stick. She could hear a steady flump, thud, bang, smack, as books of different weights landed on the floor. She forced herself not to look until she had finished kitting herself out. What she saw when she at last turned to look made her freeze mid-breath. An army of books was shuffling towards her, their spines thrusting forwards. Jane hadn't really thought about the face of her book of fairy tales when they'd been talking. It was 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, a face. It was unusual for there to be one on the front cover of a book, but other than that, she hadn't given it much consideration. Now, looking at the Unread, she realised what a lovely, friendly face it had been. These faces were neither lovely nor friendly. The mouths lolled open to reveal stained yellow teeth. Ink dribbled out at both corners and trickled down the book's covers. Their eyes were wide, staring, unmoving, almost drowning out the shwish, shwish, shwish of the books dragging themselves along the flump, thud, bang, smack. As more and more Unread joined the ranks was a low, moaning, groaning sound. Ooh. Remembering to breathe at last, Jane swallowed hard, adjusted her grip on the hockey stick and charged across her bedroom, kicking out and swinging the hockey stick as she went. Many of the Unread now lay there on their covers, struggling to become vertical again, but as quickly as Jane could knock them down, there were others lumbering towards her. Swish, 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 swish. And then a large hardback book snapped shut around Jane's left calf, trapping it between pages 206 and 207. She shook her leg vigorously, but she couldn't dislodge it. If she used her hands to prise it off, she would have to stop defending herself against the other Unread. She was barely keeping the onslaught of books at bay with the hockey stick as it was. The shaking did no good. The book was shinning up Jane's leg. She could see its foul teeth on the front cover, and they were facing her right leg. If she lowered her left leg, those fangs would be able to rip into her right thigh. Thank goodness she decided to keep her clothes on. At least the denim of her jeans provided more protection than pyjamas. The trouble was, while Jane was standing on her right foot and waving her left leg in the air, she couldn't kick out at the Unread that she'd missed with the hockey stick. The barrage of books was relentless, and it wasn't long before the Unread paperback had latched onto her right shin. Jane tried to use her right hand to dislodge it while still swinging the hockey stick with her left leg. Not easy while standing on one leg. Nope, that's not right. Jane tried to use her right hand to dislodge it while still swinging the hockey stick with her left hand, not leg. Not easy while standing on one leg. She managed to loosen the book's grip by folding its front cover back and breaking its spine. It seemed to like this and began to relax and almost purr. But then Jane was distracted by a movement near her head. She stopped bending the cover and let her little finger dangle too close to the mouth of the Unread. Its teeth latched on. They weren't sharp, but their grip was strong. Jane's finger was being crushed, and the gloves were no protection. The pain was intense and almost took her mind off what she thought she had seen. Then she was being pummeled in the stomach, back and head by a volley of paperbacks. She could no longer keep her balance and crashed to the floor in a heap. The Unread had removed the paperclips from each other's fly leaves and were now airborne. As Jane curled herself into the best protective ball she could manage, she couldn't help admiring her renegade books. Just a little. It didn't seem that they were planning their offensive very cleverly. Taking full advantage of Jane's vulnerability, the Unread swarmed over her. She could feel teeth munching on her clothes, knowing it would soon be her flesh. She wondered what was happening to Mum and Dad. Surely they must have heard the noises from her room. She had cried out when the Unread had first bitten her finger, although now the pain had dulled. They must be dealing with their own Unread. What other reason could there be for them not to come and help her? She shouted as loud as she could, but her helmet and the crush of books on top of her muffled the sound. "Oh, for goodness sake," snapped a now familiar voice. "I know it's against the rules, but we can't have this. They're completely out of control. Come on, everybody." Jane's book of fairy tales began barking instructions at the other books that had been read, and it wasn't long before the Unread were forced to stop their chewing and defend themselves. Jane couldn't see what was happening, but she could hear more flumph, thud, bang, smack, a fair bit of thwack, oomph, snap, thlurp, and a lot less ooh, and much more ah. At last Jane could sit up and survey the scene. The Unread, although still squirming, were pinned to the floor by the book she had read and enjoyed. "Thank you," she said to them, and grinned at her book of fairy tales. "Yes, well, couldn't have them chewing you to pieces, could we?" it said. "How's the finger?" asked one of the books Jane had read that week. She had taken off her gloves and was examining the damage. "Just bruised, I think," she told her rescuers. There was a general mumble of approval. "Now, Jane, could you open the curtains as wide as possible, please? Once the Unread catch the first light of dawn, they'll turn back into lovely, friendly books, like us, and this whole nightmare will be over," said the book of fairy tales. Jane did as she was asked, and they didn't have to wait long before the night of the Unread was driven away by the warm light of a brand new day. The hideous faces of the Unread melted away to be replaced by the same friendly features of the other books. Immediately they began apologising for their bad behaviour. Some even cried inky tears. Together they began the process of tidying up. Some books flew back to where they had come from. Some of the more battered copies were carried by Jane, who also removed any remaining paper clips. They were so grateful and apologetic that she couldn't help feeling sorry for them. Just as Jane got into bed, hoping that now all the drama had finished, sleep would come back and start behaving itself, her mum burst into the room. "Jane, are you okay?" she asked in panic, then stopped and looked in amazement at her room. "Your books are all—" she started, then tailed off. "Is there a problem, Mum?" Jane asked, pretending she had woken her up, although not really sure why. "Our books, the news, everywhere." Mum struggled to find the right words. To begin with, Jane enjoyed watching the news reports from around the country, showing scenes of devastation and destruction. Luckily, no one had died, although there were some severe injuries. By the end of the week, though, she was really irritated by all the stupid experts speculating about how such massive seismic activity could have failed to register on any of their machines. On the first day after the night of the Unread, there were a number of interviews with people swearing that they had been attacked by their books, and the internet was full of photos and videos. By day 2, however, those people were being called nutters, and the photos and videos dismissed as having been faked. By day 3, no mention of books was made anywhere in the newspapers, on the radio, or on the TV, and most of the stuff on the internet had been removed. It annoyed Jane that just because the authorities didn't understand something, they had to pretend it hadn't happened. By day 2, the tip of Jane's little finger was dark purple and swollen. "What happened to your finger?" her mum asked, grabbing it to have a closer look. "It got trapped in a book," said Jane, without looking up from her mobile phone. Her mum didn't say anything, just gave her that weird look. Okay, so I think the moral of this story is we need to read more books. Do you think we can do that? Do you think we can all read more books so that they don't get angry and they don't attack us in the middle of the night? I think that's a good idea, don't you? Well, I hope you enjoyed this book and it didn't scare you too much. And we will be back again tomorrow for more story time when we will be starting a new book. So we will see you then. Bye-bye.